You don't have a pointer. Okay, good morning. It has me down the program as coming from Eastern Cape Parks Board, but this is not the case. I have been consulting to the Wild Coast project, which is a Jeff-funded a program that's administered and institutionally housed with the Eastern Cape Parks Board. And I've been doing this for the last 3 years, but the project's winding down, so I'm no longer representing them. And what I present here is really my own thinking on the subject matter. And the whole Eastern Cape Parks Board responsible for what I have to say. So I'll just quickly touch on some of the importance of the Ponderland Wild Coast. You probably know about it already. The threats, and then my main sort of body of interest is looking at landscape changes in some of the main habitat types. And then I pose the question, because one of the main aims of the Wild Coast project has been to establish community-based protected areas. I pose the question, is this really a viable option, certainly in the short term? And a few conclusions. So the Ponderland Centre of Endemism, globally recognised, is inclusion with the Maputo Pond and Albany hotspot. Almost 2,253 endemic plant species, probably way higher than that. That is just in a couple of sample areas, of which about 10% is endemic, and the very narrow endemics occurring within a 15-kilometre coastal belt. So it's one of the smallest and probably one of the most threatened centres of endemism. It also has a very high tree diversity and contains most of the forests of South Africa occur in this hotspot area. It's over 600 tree species. It's the highest for any temperate forest in the world, which is not often acknowledged. So yeah, these are the hotspots, and that's the tiny little Ponderland Centre. To show its relative size, this is the whole Maputo Ponderland area that we've been talking about. And then it's also been recognised within the CPF priority sites, and importantly also Ponderland is recognised as a important corridor area as well. Okay, I just want to point to something that's not really brought out, and certainly it could make important contribution towards the conservation of this area, is that there's a strong link between the bio and cultural diversity for this area, and it's been very nicely made by a recent book by Dalton and Cox, Voices from the Forest, where they obviously use this quote: plants, animals and landscapes are profoundly reflected in Xhosa language, stories, poetry, rituals and healing practices that define Xhosa culture. In a modernizing world, cultural diversity is threatened by the loss of natural diversity, and finding ways of protecting the region's biodiversity and cultural diversity is of vital importance. I'll come back to this towards the end of my talk. At the moment, the Wild Coast is really poorly protected. Less than around about 3% of the areas under formal protected areas. Mkombati, Shudeka, Dweza and tiny little Salaka. But importantly, these areas aren't, perhaps Mkombati being an exception, the other areas aren't particularly well managed and still subjected to many of the threats that are occurring outside, such as alien invasives and illegal logging or poaching. There's something of a paradox about communal areas, which one really sees in the Wild Coast, and that is that there's a relatively low human footprint, certainly in terms of infrastructure, but yet these areas, in comparison to commercial farming, these areas are still suffering degradation and are extremely vulnerable. And this degradation threatens obviously the biodiversity, but also the so-called livelihood safety net function, where many people are still dependent on natural resources, and also the cultural integrity of these people living there. I'll just mention this idea of the myth of rural development. I won't actually go down that black hole because it could get there. talk about in a minute actually. Some of the threats, inappropriate development, and one probably knows about the dune mining, and what isn't often realized, it's a huge area that is being targeted. And also the N2 coastal road, N2 toll road that goes through this greenfields area, which is really your prime Ugi, Ponderland side and grassland. Perhaps no coincidence that these two areas are really coincide with each other. And then, yeah, the wild coast, it's sad. It's really a graveyard for white elephant projects, if you like to put it like that. I mean, this is just next to Mzikaba rivers down here. Somebody's gone and dumped literally hundreds and hundreds of toilets just in the middle of nowhere. Somebody got a tender project to put up toilets. It doesn't matter where, but they put them. So I mean, you can have it done with a good view, I suppose. Yeah, proudly funded by D4S24L4 half-finished projects. It's really sad. And then, yeah, recently they've put out the Eastern Cape de Deer, the so-called Wild Coast SDF. I'm not sure what stage of development this is, but I really objected to this idea that they've allocated 5 first-order nodes and 15 second-order nodes along the Wild Coast. And if you read what the definition of these nodes are, it really allows a relatively high level of development. And they're in sensitive areas. Most of them are in critical biodiversity areas. Ngazana, for example, is a second-order node. So I'm not sure where they're going with this. Okay, the direct causes of biodiversity loss are not uncommon to most areas. Invasive plants are really a big issue. Land clearing, slash and burn, non-sustainable harvesting, overgrazing, burning. Nothing that's not happening in this province as well. Okay, more importantly, are what's behind these issues are the socioeconomic drivers. And the population pressure, one really sees it looking at old photographs. There's been a lot more people moving into areas, and also driven by poverty. People need to make use of what's available when they're on the back end of their feet. Poor governance, lack of any coherent environmental management policies for this region. And then, very importantly, it's a fragmented and multiple land management authorities. Communal areas in the Eastern Cape really don't have any single body that coordinates everything. You have DLA, Department of Forestry, Eastern Cape Parks Board, and the DEER as well. So they're all kind of not knowing what each other's doing. And then, on top of this, you have a breakdown in traditional farming and resource use control measures. And there are various reasons for this. But you see really poor farming techniques that are not traditional. There's an incredible high rate of land abandonment, turnover of fields. People would chop out a forest and be there for a year or two and move on because they're not using rotational grazing and a bunch of other traditional farming methods. And then also something that's more controversial, goes into the whole social dimension, that's erosion of traditional conservation ethics. And something that's interesting is conservation is certainly still not necessarily well perceived. It's strongly linked to the colonial past and often seen as a colonial construct to control resources. And if one looks at the history of the Transkei, there are good reasons for this. The colonialists basically took the forests away, called them crown land, prevented people from using them, and then started logging them, heavily logging them. If you look in Manubi Forest, there was a sawmill right in the middle of the forest. And to this day, there's an absence of large yellowwood. It still hasn't recovered from colonial logging. And then the apartheid government came in and did similar kind of thing. So we work against the backlog of perception of conservation being something to control resources. Okay, one of the biggest threats in the Wild Coast, invasive alien plants, and I don't think people realize the degree of this threat. These are the main culprits, but there's over 100 invasive plants. Most of them are from South America, and I think we've inherited a lot of them that come down from this province. One of the assessments this is done by Working for Water. It's horribly underestimated in my opinion. They don't even mention, for example, chromaline in some of these blocks. It's got 10 to 30% cover. And my view is that we're seeing an exponential increase of many of the alien plants at the moment. These plants weren't recorded about 25 years ago, and I'll give some reasonably good evidence why I say that. Many of the areas you see what is largely an alien plant landscape, and what I've done in this photograph, I've increased the green scale, and all these light green are invasive aliens, Chromalina, Lantana, and a gang of them. They tend to hang out in gangs. And so this is not uncommon. This is the road to, I think it's on the road to Invasive. It's basically in Sabine forest area, heavily infested and on the increase. People use invasive plants as hedging as well, so there's really a poor perception about the dangers of invasive plants. And it's impacting heavily on their grazing lands. You can see it's probably 50% of the grazing lands being lost. Okay, the scarp forests, the dominant forest in that area. There's been a lot of slash and burn, removal of forest, like 10-20% roughly. But more importantly, there's been a lot of degradation of the remaining forest, mostly from invasive plants. And this is a typical site, what you see of a piece of land chopped out, and this probably was used as a maize farm for a year or two, then it's left fallow. And what happens is the invasive plants move in, the light green here. So it provides a foothold for invasive plants to get in, not only into the grassland, but into the forest. And if you don't believe that invasive plants can't get into the forests, this is a shot taken near Boeki. This is Chromalina that's actually climbed to the top of the forest. So it actually doesn't wait to be drowned out by trees. There's also a disturbing increase in creepers. Some of them are actually indigenous, but there's also morning glory and a bunch of alien creepers. And you see forests, a lot of forests being drowned or swamped by creepers. For example, like this, there's a bunch of aerial photographs that John Costello taken from the helicopter. You can't actually get to these areas. And it really looks like a cancer that's taken over. And a lot of this is Chromalina, but again, it's mixed. It's difficult to see if it's any one particular species. And it's a flammable species like Chromalina obviously get in there and it burns out forests, and it actually promotes the plants. So you'll see something like this in aerial satellite pictures. It looks like burn marks. These light green are areas where fire and a mixture of invasive plants, particularly Chromalina. This is just north. This is the Mzimvubu River. This river you see coming in below here, so just north of Fort St. John's. And this kind of stuff carries on. It's not just one. And then even in inaccessible places like Fraser Gorge, you see alien creepers and stuff coming in. It's inaccessible to humans. And then when I started the Wild Coast project, one of the things was to map out the reserves and to map out degradation and where the plantations were. This is Farmy Forest. It's just north of Bilambula. These are plantations. They're all defunct. All the plantations in the Wild Coast, certainly the coastal area, are no more in use. And these are areas that are degraded. And if you go in there, it mostly looks like this. It's a mixture of different alien plants, but particularly Mauritian thorn. Mauritian thorn is the worst. And it gets right into the canopy, over the canopy. A couple of other indigenous, like the canopy grass, also increases, which is the wild bamboo. And the same for Pagela State. These are state forests. That's happened under the watch of DAF, if you like. The same thing. The canopy sort of collapsed under. It looks like it's collapsed under this Mauritian thorn invasion. Okay, I came across some work done by Bruce Mackenzie in 1984. He published a paper on landscape changes in the Wild Coast. I think it was his PhD, and he had 3 plots just below Huleka. And these provide quite an interesting time mark, and certainly for aliens, as he doesn't mention the presence of aliens there at all. And I went back to his plots and I remeasured the forest loss, and the area is already covered in aliens. So one can use these 1984 as a timeline where there were virtually no aliens in the Wild Coast. Yeah. So it's like a 20-year increase, and I think we're on really on the steep exponential curve now. In terms of forest loss, it's also quite interesting that there's been 60% loss of forest in these plots since 1939, but most of this has occurred after Bruce Mackenzie measured it, when I remeasured them. So most of the loss has occurred since his plots were 1984, but sorry, most of the loss has occurred after 1994. So it's, yeah, it's probably stabilized now. There was a period where there was a lot of forest loss after 94, and it seems to have stabilized a bit now. And this is from the Mackenzie plots. I added my data to his, and this gives a general trend of what's happening across the wild coast in terms of landscape change. A decline in forests, increase in woodland, a decline in grasslands, and an increase in cultivated land. But to a large extent, it's not necessarily land that's active, it's increasing land that's old cultivated land. So there's high turnover of land that have been cultivated and left to go fallow. Okay, another thing on the coast, quite recently I've been noticing this sort of phenomenon is completely degraded red milkwood dune forests. And anyone knows the wild coast, one of the sort of iconic hallmarks of the wild coast are these beautiful red milkwoods coming right down to the beach, nice hammock places. And you come across this dead old milkwood trees, and I asked myself, what's going on here? So I spent some time walking around in there, looking at satellite imagery, and I come to a couple of conclusions. The first is, one noticed it's invaded by alien plants. This is lantana, and there's inkberry and a couple of other things. And these trees are dying, so what's killing them? People said, yeah, there were big high seas in 2007 associated with a storm front and equinox. But anyway, one sees that this degradation, this sort of the loss of integrity of your dune fringe has occurred since before 2006 at least. So it's not necessarily these high seas between the 2007 storm years, but it certainly has got worse if you compare this. The leading edge has got, it looks a lot more frayed, if you like. The integrity has declined. So it's ongoing. Okay, so you look inside some of these and you see shifting sand dunes. The sand's actually moving, and what's happening is it's burying the red milkwood trees. And whether that's killing them or it's something else or a combination, I don't know, but they're dying off. These trees are old, they've been around for hundreds of years. So something has changed in the tree, in the system that hasn't happened in the last 400 or 500 years. And then you come across these critters, and that kind of completed the picture for me. These guys go into the milkwood forest to eat the red milkwood berries, which incidentally are highly nutritious. And it actually links to a CPF project that I'm busy with now, looking at so-called superfood that grows naturally in the wild. It turns out that this red milkwood berry is probably, could classify as highly nutritious superfood that has very high in oleic oil and could be used as an olive oil substitute. It's still preliminary. I haven't actually found analysis on this particular coastal red milk, but there's a lot of work done on the Transvaal red milkwood where the data shows that this is actually high in minerals and high in oleic and a lot of other nutrients as well. So the goats are onto something. Okay, so to put the whole thing together, the three drivers, the alien plants are needed, the goats are needed, and then possibly climate change, the high seas. And you put these three together and you get the erosion of the dunes, the shifting dunes, and the total loss of red milkwood. What I did was also, I looked at the dunes south of the wild coast, around Sinsa, where you don't have goats. And you also don't have people harvesting, which is another factor but not a main driver. And what I noticed there was that you had breaching of the dunes from the high seas and the loss of integrity, and some of the fringe trees actually fell over. But there's been recovery. The understory is actually grown over the dunes and stabilized the sand dunes, and that's because there are no goats. So the picture seems quite clear to me that you need these three drivers. But the worrying thing is that there are a lot more, these processes are ongoing, and one can expect a lot more to happen. Unless you can keep goats out, and that's something one can look at, particularly if you can convince people to pick up the berries before the goats eat them and perhaps get some marketable value from them. Okay, mangrove loss. There's about 17 estuaries on the wild coast with mangrove. The wild coast got really good condition estuaries along, and a lot of them are still free-flowing rivers. If not many free-flowing rivers in the country, and the ones in the wild, a lot of them in the wild coast are. This is Bilangula. They lost all the mangroves, I think, about 5-6 years ago when there was closure of a mouth and back flooding. The second year, about 2 years ago, I'm going to run through this, there was the same thing happened at Kubankaba, which is the southernmost mangrove population in the world. And if you can compare this, now 2005, this fringe is intact, and this is dead mangrove, so you kind of looks. That's what it looks like today. It's the same thing, back flooding of mangroves, closure of the mouth, probably caused by two things: upstream abstraction, there's a lot of forestry, and also high seas that have closed the mouth. And this hasn't happened in a long time. These are over 500 years old. So something's changed in the system. Grasslands highly transformed, more than 44%, which is a lot higher than the Sanby classification that used national land cover. This pushes it into the endangered category, which changes the whole ball game for the N2 toll road. They must redo the EIAs. Woodlands have increased, blah, blah, blah. I just want to show you this interesting photograph. Compares 1942 with 1995 from a Manubi forest. And you see this, there's a lot more cultivation that was happening in 1942. Look at the lands that is none here. But also these areas are quite open, and they become heavily encroached by 1995. And most of this happened after 62, because the areas are still quite open. And it could be associated with high rainfall years, or perhaps climate change, increased CO2, and William Bond's whole theory about it. So again, changes are happening. That's the same area that that was open in 1962. It's become heavily bushed. Yeah, so most of the wild coast is this mosaic of grasslands and forest, and I'm saying basically this, the balance that's kept this relatively sort of relative balance has changed because of alien plants, increased fire, and perhaps climate change. Yeah, I don't really have time to go into what the Wild Coast project was doing in mapping reserves, and these are the priority areas we're working in. That's a CSR thing that Amy and Belinda were involved in. So the Wild Coast project proposed a bunch of reserves. Some are small, some are big, some have really got communities behind them and waiting for it to go, and just what's holding it up is the whole procedural thing of going through DAF, the different landowners, DLA. But yeah, there's a long time lag before these reserves ever get proclaimed and then managed as conservation areas. In the meantime, what is needed is yeah, the chances of them actually being managed properly as reserves by the Eastern Cape Parks Board are also not that good. They're highly, the organisation is stretched, underfunded, and just battling even to keep existing reserves going. Yeah, just a point I want to make is there's no government institute, certainly in Eastern Cape, that's dedicated to development of community-based natural resource management and developing these co-management structures that are essential for community reserves. So what I'm saying, protected areas are a long-term solution. More immediate actions are needed to stop biodiversity loss and so-called landscape-wide resource management linked to rural development activities. So protected areas are fine, but it's not going to solve these problems in the short run. One needs to link this to rural development. And the idea that rural development isn't just about providing roads and power lines. In fact, these things are just visible things to win votes. It should be more about providing extension services that improve the way resources are used and managed, and trying to encourage eco-farming and conservation. To me, that should be what rural development should be about. And then, communities really need to see the values of conservation. This is the difficult sell that we need to do is convincing people that conservation really is going to be beneficial to them in the long run. The vision for the Wild Coast is trying to link these small community reserves that do have a fighting chance of getting proclaimed into a larger vision, the so-called Wild Coast Botanical and Cultural World Heritage Site. So linking the cultural with the botanical to me is the way really to sell the message to higher levels of government in that province. And yeah, it's not too late to say the essential qualities of the wild coast, but time is running out. Thank you.
Unfortunately, as he indicated, the time is running out. He has run out of time. Thank you, Derick. I think if you do